Imagine it's the dead of winter in 14th century Europe. The wind howls through cracks in wooden walls. Snow seeps under the door. There's no central heating, no insulation, no electric blanket. Now imagine this. The secret to surviving the night isn't a fireplace, it's your cow. Not outside in a barn, not in a distant stable, but right there, inside, breathing beside you, sometimes inches from your bed. Medieval families didn't just tolerate livestock indoors, they depended on them. And the reason why might completely change the way you picture life in the Middle Ages. When modern Americans imagine medieval life, they often picture castles, knights in shining armor, or dramatic scenes straight out of Game of Thrones. But for the overwhelming majority of people, peasants, farmers, craftsman life looked nothing like that. It was smaller, colder, darker, and far more practical. Most rural families across medieval England, France, and parts of Germany lived in modest one-room homes known as longhouses. These structures were built from timber frames packed with wattle and daub, essentially sticks, woven together and plastered with mud, clay, and straw. The roofs were thatched with reeds or straw. Windows were rare and usually just small openings covered by shutters. But here's the detail that surprises modern audiences. Humans and animals often lived under the same roof, not because they were primitive, not because they didn't know better, but because it made perfect sense. In many regions, particularly in colder northern climates, the longhouse was divided into two sections. One end housed the family. The other end, slightly lower in elevation, was reserved for animals: cows, goats, sheep, sometimes pigs. There was no thick wall separating them, often just a wooden partition. The heat from the animals' bodies would naturally rise and warm the human side of the house. And in a world without reliable fuel, that warmth meant survival. Firewood wasn't always easy to obtain. In some areas, forests were controlled by local lords. Peasants couldn't simply cut down trees freely. In other regions, especially by the late Middle Ages, deforestation made wood scarce and expensive. So families relied on peat, dung, or small bundles of sticks to fuel their hearth. The hearth, usually located in the center of the house, had no chimney. Smoke drifted upward and seeped out through the thatched roof or small vents. It made eyes sting and lungs burn, but it also helped preserve the roof by coating it in soot, deterring insects and rot. Still, even with a fire burning low, temperatures inside could drop dangerously at night. That's where the animals came in. A single cow can generate a significant amount of body heat, roughly equivalent to several small heaters running continuously. Multiply that by 2 or 3 animals, and suddenly the interior temperature of a small home could rise noticeably. The animals' warmth radiated through the wooden partition and into the shared living space. For medieval families, this wasn't disgusting. It was ingenious. And warmth wasn't the only reason. Security played a major role too. Livestock were not pets, they were wealth. A cow could provide milk, butter, cheese, and eventually meat. Sheep offered wool. Goats gave milk and meat. Pigs could be slaughtered and preserved for winter. Losing an animal to theft or predators could devastate a family's survival prospects. Keeping animals inside reduced that risk dramatically. In regions plagued by wolves or roaming bandits, a cow tied just a few feet away was far safer than one left in a distant barn. Remember, many peasant homes didn't have separate barns at all. Building materials were expensive. Labor was precious. It made far more sense to construct one sturdy structure instead of 2 weaker ones. But what about hygiene? Modern sensibilities recoil at the idea. The smell, the noise, the manure. Yes, it was messy. But medieval homes were already far from sanitized by modern standards. Floors were typically dirt, sometimes covered with rushes, bundles of straw, or weeds spread across the ground. These rushes absorbed spills, food scraps, and yes, animal waste. They were replaced periodically. Animals were usually kept slightly lower than the human sleeping area, allowing waste to collect away from bedding. Some longhouses had shallow drainage channels to carry away liquid waste. It wasn't spotless, but it was functional. And for people who had never known indoor plumbing, it wasn't shocking to them. The real shock would have been freezing to death. The medieval climate adds another layer to this story. From roughly the 14th century onward, Europe experienced what historians call the Little Ice Age, a period of cooler temperatures and harsher winters. While the coldest phases came later, even earlier centuries saw brutal seasonal swings. A poorly insulated home during a long winter could be lethal. Families slept together in shared beds, not out of affection alone, but for warmth. Parents, children, sometimes even servants would pile under wool blankets. Beds were expensive pieces of furniture. Many people slept on straw mattresses laid over wooden frames. Add livestock heat to that human body warmth, and the difference between life and death became measurable. But the relationship wasn't purely utilitarian. Over time, a certain familiarity developed between people and their animals. Children grew up around them. They knew their cow's temperament. They named certain animals. They recognized which goat kicked and which one didn't. While these weren't pets in the modern American sense, they weren't emotionally invisible either. The medieval worldview didn't draw a sharp line between inside and outside life the way modern suburban living does. The home was not a sterile sanctuary separated from work. It was the center of survival. Work, sleep, cooking, craft production, and animal care happened in overlapping spaces. Everything revolved around endurance. And perhaps the most surprising part? This wasn't limited to one obscure village. Archaeological evidence from across England, Scandinavia, and parts of Central Europe confirms the widespread use of byre houses structures, intentionally designed to house humans and cattle together. Excavations reveal post holes and flooring patterns that clearly separate living quarters from livestock. Stalls within the same building footprint. It was architectural planning, not desperation. So when you imagine medieval families tucked into bed beside a snorting cow, it's not a sign of backwardness. It's a sign of adaptation. They engineered their homes around the realities of their environment. They maximized heat. They protected their wealth. They used every resource available. And as we'll see in the presence of animals inside the home, shaped not only survival, but family life, social customs, and even medieval beliefs about the natural world. Because sharing your roof with livestock didn't just change the temperature. It changed everything. In much of medieval England and Northern Europe, especially between the 12th and 15th centuries, rural homes followed a pattern historians call the byre house. The word byre literally means cowshed, but instead of being separate from the house, the byre was attached or fully integrated into it. Picture a long rectangular structure. At one end, the animals stood in stalls on packed earth. At the other end, slightly elevated on wooden planks or a stone base, the family cooked, ate, worked, and slept. Between them, a wooden partition that muffled sound but did little to block warmth or smell. At night, the house was alive. Cows shifted their weight. Goats bleated softly. Chickens clucked from rafters. A pig might snort in its pen. These weren't distant barn sounds. They were immediate, intimate, rhythmic. For medieval children, these noises were as normal as the hum of a refrigerator is to us. And that proximity shaped how people understood animals not as distant creatures, but as co-inhabitants of shared space. Modern Americans often separate home life and work life. But in medieval society, there was no such line. The house was the workplace at dawn. Before the sun fully rose, the first task often involved the animals. Milking cows, feeding goats, checking hooves, removing manure. These activities happened inside or directly beside the living space. Children learned responsibility early. A 6 or 7-year-old might help carry water or scatter feed. Teenagers took on heavier duties. Life expectancy was shorter, and labor was constant. When livestock shared your home, work never fully stopped. You couldn't ignore it. You stepped around it. You smelled it. You heard it breathing. And strangely, that created awareness. Medieval people were intensely attuned to animal behavior. They noticed subtle changes, restlessness, appetite shifts, unusual sounds. A cow's illness wasn't just unfortunate. It threatened the household's survival. Milk production might drop. Butter stores might shrink. Winter reserves could weaken. Animals were economic lifelines, but they were also status symbols. Owning multiple cattle signaled relative prosperity. In many villages, livestock ownership determined a family's standing within the community. Records from medieval England show that disputes over stolen cows or wandering pigs were taken very seriously in local courts. A stolen cow wasn't minor theft. It was catastrophic loss. Keeping animals indoors minimized that risk. Let's address the elephant, or rather, the cow in the room. The smell. Yes, medieval homes smelled strongly by modern standards. Animal waste, smoke from the hearth, damp straw, unwashed wool garments, all combined into a dense atmosphere. But here's the surprising twist. Medieval people were accustomed to layered smells. The concept of fresh indoor air barely existed. Even wealthy homes had limited ventilation. To them, the scent of livestock wasn't inherently repulsive. It meant security. It meant milk in the morning, cheese aging for winter, wool for clothing, meat for feast days. In fact, manure itself was valuable. Animal waste was carefully collected and used as fertilizer. In agricultural communities, manure meant better crops. Better crops meant survival. Nothing was wasted. Even urine had uses: tanning leather, processing wool, cleaning fabrics. When everything around you is a resource, disgust becomes a luxury. Living in such close quarters with livestock influenced medieval spirituality and folklore. In Christian Europe, animals were seen as part of God's created order. Biblical imagery reinforced this connection. Think of the Nativity story, where Christ is born among animals in a stable. That image resonated deeply with medieval peasants because it mirrored their reality. They understood holiness emerging from humble spaces. Some regions even developed folk beliefs that animals possessed heightened sensitivity to spiritual events. There were traditions claiming cattle would kneel at midnight on Christmas Eve in recognition of Christ's birth. Whether literally believed or symbolically cherished, such ideas reveal how deeply animals were woven into everyday life. In Scandinavian longhouses, where harsh winters were even more extreme, animals under the roof were considered protective. Their presence symbolized prosperity and continuity. In times of plague or famine, when death felt close and unpredictable, the steady breathing of livestock at night may have offered strange comfort. Life was fragile. Animals were constant. Archaeological digs across England, Germany, and Scandinavia reveal consistent design features that support this shared living arrangement. Excavations show drainage channels carved into floors near livestock areas. Elevated platforms mark human sleeping quarters. Post holes indicate structural divisions inside single buildings. This wasn't chaotic cohabitation. It was intentional engineering. Even after stone construction became more common in some areas, integrated animal housing remained standard in many rural regions. Separate barns became more widespread only as agricultural productivity increased and wealth expanded, particularly medieval period. As Europe moved toward the early modern era, wealthier farmers began constructing detached barns. But for centuries, the combined homebuyer remained efficient and practical. And importantly, this practice wasn't unique to England. Across medieval Europe, from the Alps to the British Isles, variations of the byre house existed. Climate, terrain, and resources shaped the exact layout, but the principle was the same. Conserve heat, protect wealth, centralize life. Now here's where modern audiences often misunderstand medieval life. Sharing space with livestock didn't automatically mean people treated animals as equals. These were working creatures. They were slaughtered when necessary. Their economic value always came first, but proximity changes perception. Children formed attachments. Farmers spoke to their cows while milking them. Shepherds recognized individual sheep. Medieval literature, even legal records, sometimes referenced animals by distinguishing traits. It wasn't sentimental in the modern pet owner sense, but it wasn't purely cold either. It was pragmatic intimacy. That intimacy shaped daily experience in ways we struggle to imagine today. Because when your survival depends on another living creature, when its warmth literally keeps your children from freezing, that relationship carries weight. By the late Middle Ages, gradual changes in agricultural methods, population shifts after the Black Death, and evolving building techniques began altering rural housing patterns. But for centuries before that transformation, the medieval home was not divided into clean categories of human space and animal space. It was one ecosystem. We'll explore what ultimately changed this centuries-old arrangement and how rising wealth, urbanization, and shifting ideas about hygiene slowly pushed animals out of the bedroom and into the barn. And when that happened, something more than architecture changed. The very definition of home began to evolve. For centuries, the shared home buyer worked. It kept families warm. It protected livestock. It maximized limited resources. It fit the medieval world perfectly. So what changed? Why did Europeans and eventually early Americans decide that animals no longer belonged under the same roof? The answer isn't a single event. It's a slow transformation driven by climate shifts, economic growth, disease, architecture, and a powerful new idea: comfort. In the mid-14th century, the Black Death swept across Europe, killing an estimated 1/3 to 1/2 of the population. The plague didn't just devastate families, it reshaped society. With fewer workers available, surviving peasants suddenly had leverage. Labor became more valuable. Wages in some regions rose. Land previously overcrowded became available. Over time, this created opportunities for slightly larger homes and improved structures. When families had more land and resources, building separate barns became more feasible. That it didn't happen overnight. For generations after the plague, byre houses still existed. But gradually, especially in parts of England and the Low Countries, agricultural efficiency increased. Crop rotation improved. Selective breeding enhanced livestock quality. Farms became more productive. More productivity meant more wealth. More wealth meant options. And with options came change. Medieval homes were communal spaces. One room often served as kitchen, workshop, dining hall, and bedroom. But beginning in the late Middle Ages and accelerating into the early modern period, a new architectural idea emerged: separation. Rooms began to specialize. Instead of one large shared hall, houses slowly incorporated distinct sleeping chambers. Chimneys replaced central hearths, allowing smoke to exit through controlled flues rather than drifting through open rafters. Upper floors became more common. This architectural evolution made it easier and more desirable to move animals out as indoor air improved and houses became less smoky. The presence of livestock became more noticeable and less tolerable. What once blended into the general haze of smoke and earth now stood out at the same time. Cultural attitudes toward cleanliness began shifting. Medieval people were not ignorant of cleanliness. Despite popular myths, they washed when possible, valued fresh linens, and maintained certain standards. But their understanding of disease differed from modern germ theory by the 16th and 17th centuries. Ideas about miasma, the belief that bad air caused illness, became more influential. If foul smells caused sickness, then reducing indoor odors mattered. Animals, once valued primarily for warmth, now became potential health hazards in the public imagination. Gradually, wealthier households began constructing detached barns as a sign of refinement. To keep animals outside was not only practical, it was respectable. The definition of civilized living subtly shifted. Ironically, one of the main reasons animals had lived indoors, heat became less critical in some areas. During the coldest periods of the Little Ice Age, roughly 16th-19th centuries, winters remained harsh. But technological improvements helped families cope differently. Chimneys became standard. Enclosed fireplaces retained heat more efficiently. Glass windows, though expensive, became more common in prosperous homes. Heavy curtains and improved insulation methods developed. Peat cutting expanded in some regions. Coal use increased, especially in England by the 17th century. As alternative heating sources improved, reliance on animal body heat diminished. The cow was no longer your furnace. As Europe transitioned toward early industrialization, populations began shifting from rural villages to growing towns. In cities, space was limited. Regulations often restricted livestock ownership within urban centers. Animals might still be kept nearby, but increasingly in designated areas. The rural byre house model simply didn't translate well into dense urban streets. And when European settlers crossed the Atlantic to North America, they brought agricultural traditions with them, but also adapted quickly. In colonial America, especially in New England, harsh winters initially encouraged some close animal housing. But abundant land allowed early American farmers to build separate barns more easily than many medieval Europeans could. The American barn became iconic, large, distinct, often painted red. It stood apart from the house, symbolizing both agricultural strength and domestic separation. The home became a sanctuary. The barn became the workplace. That mental division, home versus labor, was something medieval peasants never truly had. Perhaps the most profound shift wasn't economic or architectural. It was psychological. In the medieval world, survival dominated every decision. Comfort was secondary. Warmth mattered more than smell. Security mattered more than privacy. But as society stabilized and wealth increased, even modestly, comfort rose in priority. People began valuing quieter nights, cleaner floors, less odor, greater separation between work and rest. The presence of livestock indoors, once ingenious, slowly began to feel inconvenient. What had once been necessary became undesirable. Modern audiences often assume medieval people lived with animals because they were uncivilized or unaware of better options. The reality is more complex and more impressive. They made rational decisions based on their environment, climate, economy, and technology. When fuel was scarce, animals provided heat. When theft was common, proximity provided protection. When buildings were small, integration maximized efficiency. It was adaptive architecture. In fact, in some extremely cold modern regions of the world, similar strategies have historically been used, even into the 19th century. When survival is at stake, practicality wins. The medieval byre house wasn't a symbol of ignorance. It was a symbol of resilience. There's something else we lose. When we separate animals from daily life, medieval families lived in constant awareness of their dependence on the natural world. They felt the seasons more sharply. They understood the fragility of livestock health. They knew the smell of rain-soaked wool and the sound of restless cattle before a storm. Their lives were interwoven with the rhythms of other living creatures. Today, many Americans encounter livestock only through packaging in a grocery store. The distance between consumer and source is vast. But in a medieval longhouse, nothing was abstract. Milk didn't appear in a carton. It came from the cow breathing beside you. Meat didn't arrive shrink-wrapped. It required decisions, labor, and emotional acceptance. Sharing a roof meant sharing reality. So why did medieval families share their beds, sometimes literally their sleeping space, with livestock every night? Not because they were dirty, not because they were primitive, not because they lacked imagination. They did it because it worked. It conserved heat. It protected wealth. It strengthened survival. It reflected a world where humans and animals were part of the same economic and physical ecosystem. And when that world changed, when wealth expanded, heating improved, privacy became desirable, and hygiene theories evolved, the animals moved out. But for hundreds of years, on freezing winter nights across Europe, the steady warmth of a cow behind a wooden partition may have been the difference between life and death. And that might be the most surprising reason of all. If this story changed the way you picture the Middle Ages, imagine what else history has quietly misunderstood. Because sometimes what sounds strange to us was simply smart.